I joined a grad student team under Ere or Arandaria Aceves in SMEA, along with three grad students, Samantha Freiberg, Axel Perkins, and Carson Green. They'd been working on this project for a year, and then I joined them for this year. And it was their master's thesis, and it was about creating a framework for socio-ecological systems and the management of them. And they did this through 3 case studies. Kivalina, which is in northwestern Alaska. It's a very rural native community. Hawaii and the natives in Hawaii, and the Duwamish community here in Washington. So my role in this was a split kind of into quarters. Fall quarter, I did a large literature review, source finding for the introductions part of the team's paper. This ended up becoming a majority of the writing for the introduction and background section of the thesis. Winter quarter, I made an interactive story map that goes through all of the case studies in a interactive way with lots of pictures and quotes and directly from interviewed community members. And then this quarter, I did my paper, which is what I'll be presenting on today, which is kind of a synthesis of all my research and all of my work throughout this year. And then also I was there because there were 3 grad students and I brought youth to the group. And jokes aside, I got 3 personal mentors to help me with the job that I now have and all of my writing. And it was just really wonderful to have those 3 students to help me out. But into the project. Again, I looked at the triple crisis that we're currently facing. So human societies and natural systems are inextricably linked. We have 3 interconnected crises that build off each other to threaten socio-ecological systems. First is climate change, one that we're very well aware of. We're currently facing unprecedented global warming. Our global average has raised by 1.1 degrees Celsius since the pre-industrial era. Second is nature loss or biodiversity loss. That's, depending on the area, 100 to 1,000 times more than the background rate of extinction, and is said to be the 6th mass extinction. And then finally, social inequity, which is the unequal burdens and benefits distributed across communities worldwide of the the effects of these 2 crises. These stressors definitely don't operate in isolation, and we historically have tried to manage them in a isolated form, but they actually have compounding impacts that destabilize ecosystems and amplify each other's vulnerabilities and very much build on each other. So climate change is definitely the catalyst. As I said earlier, global surface temperatures worldwide have raised 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. This definitely varies based on where you are in the world. For instance, Arctic warming is 2 to 4 times the global average. This has to do with sea ice and the Arctic environment changing a lot faster. Tropical regions are seeing altered precipitation and disrupted agriculture, and then coastal areas worldwide are seeing sea level rises and intensified storm patterns. Climate change acts as both a driver and an amplifier of these other crises. So the double inequity paradox is the idea that those contributing least face the gravest consequences. For example, indigenous people, which currently only make up 6% of the population, of the global population, steward 80% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity, and have many cultural and livelihood ties to that biodiversity that are diminishing day by day. And then there's also many socioeconomic patterns, very prevalent in the US as well as worldwide, where the poorest populations have a 40% higher mortality in climate disasters and climate patterns. And then historical injustices such as redlining, compound current vulnerabilities. And then for energy, 85% of fossil fuel reserves are on or near indigenous territories. These indigenous territories are also the ones stewarding 80% of our Earth's remaining biodiversity, so they're definitely under threat. Nature loss or biodiversity loss, like I said, we are currently facing the 6th mass extinction. Extinction rates are currently 100 to 1,000 times higher than the natural background level. 1.6 billion people depend directly on forests, and another 3 billion rely on marine proteins as their primary protein source. And those ecosystems are both diminishing very quickly. There are key drivers for this nature loss happens on multiple scales. More locally, habitat fragmentation and deforestation. Climate-driven thermal stress happens worldwide. Pollution and biochemical changes, and then over-harvesting of both targeted and incidental species. Often looked past is the ecosystem services that our world provides. There's 4 critical categories of ecosystem services. The most well-known is definitely provisioning, food, water, protein, timber, and medicine. Those are all under threat as nature loss, as biodiversity continues to be diminished. The regulating services such as climate regulation, flood control, water purification, that coastal communities all depend on. The cultural services such as recreation, spiritual, and the aesthetic value that the outdoors provides. And then the most overlooked is the supporting services such as soil formation and nutrient cycling. 70% of the world's poor depend directly on biodiversity, so as we are diminishing the world's biodiversity, they are the ones to struggle from that. And climate disturbances intensify threats to these services, and the vulnerable populations that this directly affects lack the resources and money able to, giving them the ability to adapt to these. Social inequity, from my research, I found that it comes in really 3 dimensions. First is the distributional equity, which is the fair allocation of environmental benefits and harms. Like I said before, those who get the less, those who do the least for pollution and all this stuff, such, tend to face the greatest consequences. One example of this is that pollution facilities are disproportionately located near marginalized communities, which excessively diminishes ecosystem around those communities, although because they are the poorer communities, they don't have the resources in order to adapt to them. Procedural inequity is the inclusivity of the decision-making process. It was found that only 12% of climate plans adequately budget for low-income community adaptation, because those voices are not heard nearly as much, and that is due to the many complex barriers that exclude marginalized voices from being heard in the decision-making process. And then recognitional equity, which is the validation of diverse knowledge systems and rights. Traditional territories are often redefined as wilderness instead of an area that is being looked after by a indigenous group. And it's, in all my research, I found that indigenous management is delegitimized despite the better incomes that they tend to have. Often the more qualitative data that comes from indigenous and indigenous knowledge-based systems is seen as like a side piece. It's opposed to more scientific data. These three crises all directly feed on each other. For instance, climate change drives species distributional shifts and habitat degradation. This leads to excessive nature loss, which reduces carbon sequestration and ecosystem resilience, which then in turn leads to higher rates of climate change. Climate change impacts disproportionately affect disadvantaged communities, but the inequity limits the resources for mitigation and adaptation, leading to higher rates of climate change. Biodiversity loss hits subsistence-based communities, which tend to be poor, marginalized communities, the hardest, and due to this, the marginalization forces unsustainable resource extraction in order to survive. The triple jeopardy creates a cascading system failure that then affects the entire population. So like I said before, marginalized communities face a triple burden, where those that contribute the least to global emissions tend to bear the greatest impacts, but they also have a very limited adaptive capacity and are excluded from the decision-making process. Local ecological knowledge, or LEK, offers critical insights to management strategies, including experiential place-based understanding that often precedes formal assessments by years or even decades, but is unfortunately historically undervalued in Western science. For example, fishermen often can make educated guesses about fish populations far before scientific fisheries, although it's usually seen as anecdotal instead of any real data. I found through my research that conservation outcomes improve exponentially with community involvement, and that a narrative-based approach that bridges knowledge systems is important for our management going forward. So I talked a lot about all of the negatives, but there is definitely hope going forward. But in order to do this, we have to use integrated approaches that address the root cause instead of the symptoms. This involves reforming power dynamics within governance to include marginalized groups in both design and implementation of management strategies. In order to do this, we must dismantle systematic barriers to participation. It also requires multidimensional equity approaches for all three types of equity, including distributional, procedural, and recognition. And we must use context-specific solutions that respect diverse worldviews and differing ecosystems, using a polycentric governance that enables adaptive management. So, climate change, nature loss, and social inequity interact through very complex feedback systems. This includes integrated. In order to dismantle this, we must use integrated approaches that can create positive synergies, using community agency and diverse knowledge systems as essential management skills. For future research, I would love to see more sophisticated methodologies that analyze the social ecological interactions, effective governance arrangements, and frameworks for integrating diverse knowledge systems. And the path forward requires collaborative and transdisciplinary approaches. Thank you so much for listening.
Questions?
When You said that you were observing 3 different groups?
Yes.
One was from Alaska, one was Hawaii, and one was the Duwamish. Was there any specific skew as far as like were there observed effects more heavily in one group versus another?
Definitely. So those 3 case studies were chosen because Kivalina in Alaska,
Yeah.
definitely the most rural and most heavily affected as they're in the Arctic Circle. Hawaii was kind of the middle one because it's a very, there's just a large scale, but it's also an island, so it's very dependent on the earth. And then the Duwamish community has been, it's still very, they definitely have a community, but all of their historical land has been wiped out and diverted. So we looked at we used it as like a scale from one to the other to look at all of the changes that happened.